Hey, hello, good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started. So last time we discussed the difference between networks and groups, and we saw evidence for spreading processes in networks for diverse phenomena using both observational and experimental data. And we examined some possible explanations for correlations in attributes across connected individuals, including the ideas of induction, homophily, and context or confounding through exposure to some third factor. Well, what do things spread online too? Is it just offline and face-to-face networks, or is there kind of an interpersonal influence that can be manifested online as well? And does the online world actually resemble the offline world, or how is it different than the real face-to-face interactions that we evolved to have? What might the internet offer, and how might it extend or exploit our ancient proclivities to form networks and to be influenced by those around us? Many people have argued, I think rightly, that the way the internet is designed, for example, to privilege outrage, exploits certain social and psychological features we evolved to live in the face-to-face world, and that the internet in a way exploits those in a fashion that potentially is injurious. I guess my general summary of this idea with respect to the potential differences between the online and the offline world is that online networks are the same but different. And they are the same insofar as our desire for connection and the reality for connection are present, and they are the same insofar as our desire for social influence and the reality of social influence are the same. But certain other factors are indeed quite different. There are at least 3 or 4 properties of online networks that are quite different from face-to-face networks. Enormity, which is the size of the scale of the social interactions. Communality, which is our capacity to work together online that might be facilitated or distinct from our capacity to work together offline. Specificity, which is the degree to which we can be very particularistic in our online interactions in a way that's not as easy offline. And what I call virtuality, which is the capacity to assume identities online that are not our own, that are potentially different, or that in a way that's potentially different than face-to-face interactions, or than the opportunities that are afforded by face-to-face interactions. Now here's some fascinating photographs by photographer Robbie Cooper of real people and their online avatars. So for example, online, it's much easier for men to pass as women. Men could always pass as women in face-to-face interactions, or vice versa, women as men. But online, it's easier to do that. So there's something about online networks that might facilitate what we call virtuality, which is you can assume different identities. Or here's another example. This example always struck me as phenomenally poignant. So this is a man in Germany, and that's his online avatar, side by side. And this is a little boy, for example, very seriously disabled. He's on a ventilator. You can see from his hands how his limbs are atrophied. He has a neurological and muscular deficits, and he relies on a breathing machine. And this is the avatar that he chose for himself. So disabled individuals could pass as able-bodied individuals in this type of a situation. And this image brought tears to my eyes the first time I looked at it. Of course, the little boy would pick such an impervious avatar, encased in steel, mobile, and immune to the hard knocks of the world. Let's take a look at the scale of social networks. Here's a natural social network of 105 people in a college dorm and the close friendships among those 105 people. So you might think of a building in one of the Yale colleges, for example, and the extent to which the people in that building know each other in an intimate way. We're talking about close friends, not acquaintances here. And in this sample of 105 college students, every dot is a person, Every line between them is a relationship between two people. Here, who is whose close friend. And you can see that, and you can't see, but I'll tell you, the average number of close friends is 6.6. So on average, people in this situation have 6.6 close friends. This person has one close friend. This person has, I don't know, a dozen close friends, and so on. And here's what happens when we add whether they are members of the same ethnicity-based club. So there are these ethnic-based clubs, and then who is a co-member of the club, for example, shown in the green lines. And here's what happens when you mark roommates, shown in blue, who is whose roommate. Some of these relationships are problematic, like this guy is this guy's roommate, but they're not close friends. There's a blue line connecting them, but there's no white line connecting them, which can be, awkward. And here's what happens in this old data set from, this was over 10 years ago now, or when was this published? Yeah, in 2008, when you add Facebook friends in red. And on average back then, people had 110 Facebook friends. Now, of course, all of you guys, if you use Facebook or you've moved on to Instagram and other social media, but you have many, many more interactions and connections in these online networks, is the point, than your face-to-face networks. 110 Facebook friends in this data set compared to 6.6, real friends. And here's what happens when you expand to the whole network of 1,700 students in one entire college class. This is not, of course, just a single dorm. It's, all freshmen or all sophomores or something like that. And this profusion of data can actually be quite overwhelming. So there's just so much complexity. There's so much going on in online interactions that far transcends a kind of already complex, but let's say simpler world of face-to-face interactions. So for both analytical and conceptual reasons, when looking at online networks, it's often important to discern which of the online connections are real, old-fashioned friendships or real face-to-face interactions. Because in fact, Facebook friends and other sorts of online ties can be very tenuous. They're not, really real in a sense. And the question is, do they in fact influence us in the same way and to the same extent as real face-to-face connections? So one idea we had early on, this was over 15 years ago, was that in order to discern real friends, we would use what we called the picture friends method, which is that we would require you to co-appear in a photograph with another person and to both be tagged in it in order to say that you are really friends with that person. So for example, there might be, you might have 500 Facebook friends, but actually only co-appear in a photograph with 10 of them, where you're both tagged. And to really make it good, what we would ideally want to do is exclude photographs that had many people, right? Like if you're in a photograph of 100 people and are co-tagged with the other 99, probably those aren't your real friends. But if you're in several photographs with one or two other people and you're always tagged, that means you made the investment to spend time with that person, to be photographed with that person, to upload the photograph onto your social media, and to tag it. And that provides a way to discern, potential several ways, to discern who's your real connections or who are your real connections among this profusion of online interactions that you might have. So we deployed this so-called picture friends method. And we looked at a variety of things to try to assess the degree to which there's online social influence. And it turns out that tenuous Facebook connections and similar internet connections do not have the same influence as real face-to-face friendships. When we studied whether any old Facebook friend of yours, for example, could influence your taste in music or movies or books, we found that they could not. But when we looked at your picture friends, we found that influence, at least for some things, could spread from person to person. For example, here are the top 10 movies when we did this project, 15 years ago now. You'll probably recognize most of these movies, although they may no longer be among your top 10. Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Gladiator, Wedding Crashers, and so on, all the way down to Shawshank Redemption. And then what we did is we asked the question, if one of your friends identified one of these movies on their Facebook page and expressed an interest in one of these movies, would this affect the probability that you would express an interest in one of these movies a year later or subsequent to that original friend expressing such an interest? And we found that that was the case, but only for certain movies, for Good Will Hunting, Pulp Fiction, and Love Actually. If your friends expressed an interest for one of these movies, it subsequently influenced whether you also said this was one of your favorite movies at a future point in time. So we found that we could map the spread of this taste in movies like the other things we were discussing last time. So this shows the network of movies. The yellow dots, this is the network of students taken from the data. The yellow dots are the Love Actually fans. The red dots are the Pulp Fiction fans. The orange dots are the very few fans of both movies. And you can see that this network is quite polarized, that the Pulp Fiction fans tend to be located in the center of the network and the Love Actually fans more on the periphery. And interestingly, those individuals who are fans of both tend to occupy a structurally intermediate position. They're located in the social network at the border between these two communities. Now, many businesses, or actually public health experts, I don't know what it's, interventionists, including people in my own laboratory, often think that we can just target influential people at the center of the network to spread news about a product. But actually, this would have been a mistake if you were selling the movie Love Actually. If what you're selling is Love Actually, saying, oh, I'm going to pick these very popular central people in the network and tell them about Love Actually in the hopes that we'll get a lot of adoption of Love Actually, actually that might not be such a good idea because these are the Pulp Fiction fans. So actually information both about the structure of the network, where people are located, and something about the people themselves is crucial if you're really going to optimize the exploitation of networks to maximize the adoption of desirable health properties online and also offline. Now, a few years ago, we were reminded of the distinction between real influential ties and more tenuous ties ourselves. This is an actress who you guys now probably don't know so much about. Raise your hands if you've ever heard of Alyssa Milano. How many people? Yeah, you have to be a bit older. Give me a rough count, Maggie. How many people are know who Alyssa Milano is?
So far, I only see 3, 4.
Yeah, she's not as so well known as she used to be. Anyway, this was, I don't know how many years ago this was. When was this? This was, I can't even remember. It was like 12 years ago now or 10 years ago now. Anyway, she, at the time, had 1 million Twitter followers. And very unexpectedly one day, she had 1 million Twitter followers. And very unexpectedly one day, she tweeted out a copy, a tweet about our book, a book that I wrote that was published in 2009, Connected: The Surprising Power of Our Social Networks and How They Shape Our Lives. And she put a little link to the book. And if you clicked on this link, you went right to the Amazon.com website for our book. So my co-author, James Fowler, and I were very excited when this happened. We thought, oh my goodness, this is great. Alyssa Milano has, tweeted out a link to our book to her 1 million followers. And actually that tweet was retweeted another 1 million times. So on that particular day that she sent the tweet, 2 million people saw a tweet with about our book with a link that you could go to the Amazon.com website to buy our book. And because James and I were neurotic, I deny that I'm neurotic any longer. I was only neurotic in my youth when I was in my 40s. Stop laughing, Maggie and Ryan. I deny that I was neurotic any longer, but back then we were neurotic. And at the time, we would follow the sales rank of our book. So here is the, so this was in 2010 that this occurred. So here are the time interval during which Alyssa Milano might have tweeted about our book. And here's the sales rank. So here means more sales, these lower numbers, and these higher numbers mean fewer sales. And this is the day that Alyssa Milano tweeted our book. We estimate that we did not sell a single extra copy of our book, not a single extra copy, despite the fact that 2 million people got a tweet about our book on that particular day. In fact, we published this case study. We didn't publish it. We put this case study on a blog somewhere. I can't remember where it is online. And some snarky people, after reading it, commented that actually when Milano tweeted about our book, people raced to the bookstores to return our book, which explains the decline in sales on this particular interval. Now, some of you are already probably thinking, if you're smart, well, you're all smart, but if you're especially smart, you're probably thinking, well, Nicholas, maybe this depends on what Milano is tweeting about. Maybe Milano sending tweets about books doesn't influence her followers, but if she had sent a tweet about lipstick, maybe people would have bought the lipstick. And that is a good thought, and actually was a subject of a significant amount of research in my lab, trying to figure out the spreading dynamics of different sorts of products, conditional as well on the attributes of the individual, as well as their network position. So online networks facilitate interactions on a vast scale, though, as we have seen, influence for many processes appears actually to still depend on interactions in the real world. So, in other words, to affect someone else in the online world, you also have to have a real world sort of connection with them. They can't merely be online connections. So measures of meaningful interactions are going to be needed if we are going to exploit online ties. Which online interactions represent real relationships where an influence might possibly be exerted? So for one to use online networks to effectuate behavior change, in particular with respect to public health properties, which are of the greatest interest in this class, but of course, marketers and business people and others have different agendas, to sell widgets, for instance, we're going to have to realize that the interactions must be real or feel real for online influence to be exerted. Second, that's typically, if you're going to use this online media, you're going to want to cultivate an authentic feel to online interactions and real connections among individuals if they were not already there to begin with. Second, something needs to be at stake in online interactions, like transacting business or finding a sexual partner or working together to quit smoking. To the extent that you and this other person who is a stranger to you have a shared agenda and a shared stake in some outcome, then online interactions can be quite powerful. For example, young people with diabetes that are trying to mutually support each other in the management of their diabetes, strangers can help each other because something is at stake, which is the management of diabetes. And also, we need to do something else if we're really going to advance this field of using online networks. We need to learn how to identify not just influential people, but influenceable people. We need not just leaders, but also followers, not just shepherds, but also sheep. And in fact, in many types of online situations, people are obsessed with identifying who's influential, who's influential. In many cases, it's not who's influential that's important, it's who's influenceable. Do we have procedures or methods to identify influenceable individuals? Now, smoking cessation online is one example. This is some work that was published by Nate Cobb over 10 years ago now, looking at an online network that was focused on persuading people to quit smoking. And here the red dots are the smokers and the blue dots are the non-smokers. The green lines represent closer interpersonal ties and the purple lines are looser ties. And once again, if you look at this network, you see clusters of smokers and non-smokers, just like the last lecture where I showed you clusters of smokers and non-smokers in the face-to-face network. These clusters, in other words, are present both in online and offline worlds. And in fact, this study suggests that certain kinds and amounts of online interactions are more important and are more helpful to get people to quit, to help foster quitting using these online tools. Incidentally, we also began to use online networks and our picture friends method in another way. So while we were coding these photographs, and when we did this work, a lot of the coding had to be done manually, if you can believe it. Now we can use computer vision procedures in our lab to process, thousands or millions of images. Anyway, back then it wasn't so easy. This is a Facebook network where we map the connections based on the dots are people and the lines are close friends. And now we color the dots according to whether people are smiling in their profile pictures. So the smiley people get yellow dots, the severe looking people get blue dots, and the neutral faces get green dots. And once again, you see clusters of people who seem happy in their profile pictures and who seem unhappy in their profile pictures. And in fact, we found the same kinds of findings of clustering. We found that the unhappy people were more likely to be peripheral in the social network. And we also found that smiling people had 20% more friends than non-smiling people in this analysis. Now, in another paper that we published now 6 years ago now, we found that positive and negative emotions also, we found evidence for that they can spread in massive online social networks. We used data from millions of Facebook users, and we showed that the rainfall, unsurprisingly, directly influences the emotional content of people's status messages. In other words, unsurprisingly, we found that on days when it's raining where you live, you are more likely to post gloomy statuses than on days when it's sunny. For example, last week when the weather turned for the better, many of you were no doubt posting very upbeat, happy things on your social media. And that's not so surprising that you would do that. And in fact, this effect of the weather on people's mood is a very long studied topic in the social sciences. But what we did is we were interested in assessing whether when you posted a happy message, did friends of yours in other cities who were not exposed to the same weather that you were exposed to, did they also post happy messages? In other words, this is a natural experiment to study interpersonal emotional contagion, where we use the natural occurrence over which you have no control of weather in your environment to modify your status. It's like if I had a couplet of me and Maggie, and we want to see, does my happiness make Maggie happy? We want to randomly shock me to sometimes make me happy and sometimes make me sad, and then test Maggie's mood after I am shocked. I don't mean literally, much as Maggie or Ryan might like me to receive an electrical shock. It's not what I mean. What I mean is like an exogenous shock, like a perturbation in my mood. So you experimentally perturb my mood, and you measure not my mood, but Maggie's mood as a result of the perturbation in me. And in fact, that's exactly what we found. We found a small effect of rainfall on people's own posts. An average rainy day decreases the number of positive posts by 1.2% and also increases the number of negative posts by about 1.2%. But we also found, if you focus on the blue bars, that each additional positive posts yields an additional 1.75 positive posts among one's friends. Meanwhile, each additional negative posts yields an additional 1.3 more negative posts among one's friends. And we found that positive posts inhibit negative ones in your friends and vice versa. So this is a measure of emotional contagion. We found that positive posts increase positive posts and negative posts increase negative posts. Positive posts suppress negative posts, and negative posts suppress positive posts in your friends. And in other words, the total effect of rainfall on emotional contagion is about 150% larger than we would expect if we were only measuring the direct effect on the users and ignoring the indirect effect on their friends. In sum, these results show that rain affects emotional expression, that positive and negative posts are contagious, and that positive posts tend to inhibit negative posts and vice versa. So it's a kind of natural experiment in emotional contagion online, but it's still not an actual experiment. And so my colleague, James Fowler, designed a massive social experiment in the United States with a 2010, I think it was, election. They took 61 million users on Facebook, and they randomly assigned them to get different sorts of messages that they got about whether or not their alters had voted. So they took these 61 people, and they were either going to inform them that their friends had voted or not inform them that their friends had voted. And then when people voted, they would signal, they would tag the I voted sign on Facebook. Those of you that are older than 30, you may actually remember this experiment during that election where all of a sudden everyone was expressing that they voted. And the main treatment was just a simple notification if one's particular friends had voted. And keep in mind that this is a very weak treatment. We're not paying you to go to the polls. We're not visiting your household and telling you to go to the polls. We're not henpecking you to go to the polls. We're simply informing you your friends voted. And here are the pictures of your friends that voted. Okay, so today is election day. You would get this banner on top of your Facebook page. And it says, here are your friends who voted: Jamie Settle, Jason Jones, and 18 other people. This is James Fowler here. You were notified of your friends if they voted, a little stack of them. And then you were given a little button to click I voted if you voted. Here is a little scrolling indicator of the total number of people who voted, another stimulus. And here you could also click this button here and get a little information about, conditional on where you are, where you could go. And an additional important feature of this experiment is that they were able to link, using a special technique that they describe in the paper, the online activity of subjects, in other words, whether they said they voted, to their real world activity by accessing publicly available voter records. So they were able to tell, are you lying when you click the button I voted? You see all your friends say I voted, you're like, oh, I'll just click I voted too, even though I didn't. No, they were able to link at the small group level using publicly available records. So whether you vote or not in the United States is a publicly available piece of information, not who you vote for, of course. So they were able to link these records and assess the validity of people saying I voted or not. And what they found is that giving people such a message here in a randomized controlled experiment increased the number of people who themselves went to the polls detectably. Now, the sample was huge, of course, but they saw that 50,000 extra people turned out to vote in their sample. In other words, more Americans went to the polls on that election day because my buddy did an experiment on Facebook. 50,000 extra people turned out to vote. And then when those 50,000 people turned out to vote, it resulted in an additional 300,000 other Americans also going to the polls because those individuals said, I voted. So this was, and this shows here the direct effect of 50,000 people and the indirect effect on close friends. Actually, 300,000 extra people turned out to vote. But this increased turnout only occurred among close friends. Your saying I voted had no material detectable effect on any old Facebook friend of yours. It only had its impact on your close friends. Now, the reason I'm giving you absolute rather than relative counts when I summarize this experiment is that I want to give you a sense of how even such a weak treatment online, when combined with the scale of social networks online, can actually affect very large numbers of people. But the bottom line from this part of what I've been telling you so far today is that interpersonal influence spreads online as well as offline, albeit among people who have some kind of real relationship or share some kind of very specific and an important interest between themselves. Are there any questions on what I've said so far? Does anyone look like they want to ask a question, Maggie, but they haven't? Today I can see Colin, Severin, Jennifer, and Vivian's faces. I get 4 of your faces out of, I don't know how they're chosen by the computer. So Colin, I can see if you're paying attention, Severin and Jennifer and Vivian. The rest, I have no idea what you're doing. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. All right, let's go on. Now, the work that I showed you last time and revisited a little bit this time on emotions and emotional contagion, and the work I showed you last time with respect to altruism, you know, the cascading effect of kindness within social networks, both of which are so fundamental to human experience, got us to thinking about the potential evolutionary basis of networks themselves. In other words, those are very fundamental things about human beings, whether they cooperate with each other, whether they, share smiles with each other. It's different than smoking behavior, for example, which is, more recent in onset in our evolutionary past. Those are pretty ancient things, emotions and cooperation. And the fact that they spread in networks got us to thinking about what might be the evolutionary basis or significance of human social networks. Now, human social networks always look strikingly similar. They always look like the pictures that I've already shown you so far the last couple of days, but they never look like this. They never look like a regular lattice, like a sodium chloride crystal. We do not make or live in structures of this kind. Why not? Why have I never in 20 years gone someplace and mapped a social network and come back to the lab and found a network that has this particular structure? Well, the striking patterns of human social networks, their ubiquity, and their apparent purpose beg the question of whether we evolved to have networks and to have particular kinds of networks in the first place. So the questions become, why do we form networks in the first place, and why do they have the structure that they do? And in order to understand this, we need to dissect network structure a little bit first. And so I have to introduce you a little bit to this. And in order to do that, first let me point out that if you look at this structure here, in fact, if you took this surface in 2 dimensions and wrapped it around a sphere, or actually more properly, if you wrapped it around a torus, a donut, if you wrap this around a donut, you should notice that every position is isomorphic to every other position. Everyone here has 8 connections. Every one of their friends has 8 connections. And if you wrap this around a torus in 3 dimensions, everybody would be as far away from the edge of the network as everyone else. But as you've already seen, that's not the case with natural social networks. In natural social networks, real social networks, they are different. Different people occupy different structural positions within the network. So let me give you a few formal tools to understand and describe some basic structural properties of networks. First of all, look at node B. So every dot's a person, every line's a relationship between people, whose friend, for example. Node B here has 4 connections, and node D has 6 connections. This is known as the degree of a node, the number of connections that it has. Now, if you look at nodes C and D both have 6 connections, but you should see that there's something different about C and D. You should have the intuition that C is more central in the network, whereas D is more in the periphery of the network. This is known as the centrality of a node, and this can be quantified mathematically in a number of ways. For example, using something known as eigenvector centrality, or another more intuitive technique known as betweenness centrality. Let me just digress for a moment because betweenness centrality is so cool. In betweenness centrality, what you do is you pick a node in the network and you then toggle through every other node in the network and you ask yourself, what is the shortest sequence of steps to connect those 2 nodes? So you say, okay, here's my node, and okay, to get to this node, 1, this is the path. And to get to this node, this is the path. And to get to this node, it's this, that's the closest path. There are other paths from this node to that node, but that's the shortest path. So you map, let's say there are 100 nodes in this network, and you pick this node, you map the paths, the shortest paths, to each of the other 99 nodes, and that gives you 99 shortest paths. And you do that for this node. And then you do it for the next node, and the next node, and the next node. For each node, you map the shortest path to all the other nodes. And then, as a finale, you ask, on how many of all of those paths is each node? You would find that this node here is on no paths. There's no need. You never have to go through this node. to get, this node does not lie between any two other nodes in the network, but this node lies between many other nodes in the network. It is on the shortest path through of many other connections between pairs of nodes in the network. That is betweenness centrality. It's super cool. It's super important in how, for example, germs spread in networks. If you're trying to model the spread of epidemic disease, or vaccine hesitancy spreads in networks, and so on. So that's the centrality of a node. Last, we have something known as the transitivity of a node. B has 4 connections, and A has 4 connections. But you should see that there's a difference between the two. And the difference is that B's friends are not friends with each other. They're not connected. But A's friends are friends with each other. So the friend of A's is back again a friend of A's. And this is known as the transitivity of a node. Now, the extent to which, and there are many other, by the way, these are the 3 simplest structural properties of networks, of individuals within networks you could study. There are many other things you could look at. Those are 3 of the simplest ones. And which of these are important depends on what you're discussing. Maggie, did I assign the Behrman thing on, yeah, I did, on suicide. I'll come back.
Yeah.
So one of our first papers in this regard to study the genetics and the evolutionary origins of human social networks was to use a classic twin study design and a sample of over 500 twin pairs in order to get a little hint of what was going on. You should have the intuition that identical twins, monozygotic twins, share 100% of their genes, and dizygotic or fraternal twins in expectation share 50% of their genes. And if network properties are heritable, then we would expect monozygotic twins to have networks that were more similar to each other than dizygotic twins. For example, let's look at if you had these 2 twins who were identical, and then you map their friendship network, you might find that this network looks a lot like this network. They have similar numbers of friends, similar transitivity, similar betweenness centrality, and so on. Conversely, if you look at same-sex dizygotic twins, you might see a very different pattern, that the 2 twins might differ in the nature of their network. And it's the difference between this and the difference between this, when you then compare those 2 differences, that you can form an opinion about the extent to which genes can explain human social network structure. And when we did that, what we found was the following. On the y-axis is the percent of the variance explained. And on the x-axis is the 3 things I've just introduced you to: the degree or number of ties, the transitivity of ties, and the centrality of ties. And what we found was something like 46% of the variation in how many friends you have can depend on your genes. Now, that's not very surprising. I mean, you all should have the intuition that some of you are born shy and some of you are born gregarious. People vary in their taste for friendship, and there's nothing surprising about the fact that that might relate to your genes. But we also found that 47% of your transitivity could depend on your genes. And this is one of the more bizarre results to come out of my lab in the last 15 years or so. Because what I just told you is that if you have Tom, Dick, and Harry in a room, whether Dick is friends with Harry depends not just on Dick's genes or on Harry's genes, but on Tom's genes. Whether Colin is friends with Severin depends not just on Colin's genes or on Severin's genes, but on Jennifer's genes. How can that be? Well, maybe people vary in their tendency to introduce their friends to each other. Maybe Jennifer is the kind of person that introduces her friends to each other, and she brokers introductions between Colin and Severin and knits the network around her together, such that the transitivity for some of us is different than the transitivity of others of us, depending on our own genes. So, and it also turns out that 29% of your centrality depends on your genes in a way I won't go into today, except to mention that this has something to do with your taste for popular friends. So Maggie and I might each want a similar number of friends, I want 4 friends and she wants 4 friends, but Maggie really likes to be in the center of things, so she befriends popular people. That's who she wants as her friends. But I don't like having friends who are popular because they never have any time for me. So I want unpopular friends so that, I can be the center of their attention. And so I might pick unpopular friends. And variation in your interest in popular friends could affect your centrality. So where you are in the vast fabric of humanity depends in part on your genes. And the fundamental reality of our desire for connection and of our susceptibility to influence, it turns out, has always been with us. Now, it's important to sort all this out because genes might be associated both with network topology and with behavioral outcomes. So some of the interpersonal effects that we've been studying so far might depend on both. So for example, I've just showed you that genes might affect your social networks. And previously I showed you that your social networks can affect your behaviors, like your obesity, smoking, happiness, voting, or altruistic behaviors. Other scientists, not my lab, explore and have shown how genes, for example, in the dopamine and serotonin pathways, can affect your behaviors. Whether you're a gambler or a smoker, for example, or act altruistically, or how happy you are, your serotonin levels might affect your happiness. But what's really interesting, or one of the interesting things, I think there are many interesting things, but one of the interesting things about what I've just told you is that there are all these scientists out there studying this pathway, completely overlooking this pathway, this backdoor path between genes and human behaviors. Your genes affect your networks and the networks affect your behaviors. In other ways, maybe what some of the genes that are thought to make people depressed, maybe they work not by what they do inside your brain, but by what they do outside your brain. Maybe, for instance, certain genes predispose you not just to have a kind of biochemistry that makes you sad, but instead, or in addition to that, a kind of biochemistry that makes you like depressed people. And then you surround yourself by depressed people, and they make you more depressed. So neglecting this path would result in behavior geneticists overestimating the effect of genes inside our body. And maybe even overprescribing certain medicines or going down a wild goose chase in terms of treatments, whereas that's not really what's happening to the patient physiologically. And this, it turns out, raises still further questions about why human social networks might be genetically encoded. And we believe in my lab that part of it must be because networks enhance your Darwinian fitness. In fact, much more recent work of ours, which I will not present in this class, but you can find on my website or if you Google these papers, has shown that there are correlated genotypes in friendship networks. That is, that there are genetic consequences as well as genetic antecedents to the friends we pick, and that this may have implications for natural selection. Just as your Darwinian fitness depends on the quality of mate that you pick, whether your offspring live or die, or how fit they are, depends on who you reproduce with. Well, your Darwinian fitness might also depend on who you befriend. And that fact gives evolution a lever with which to work to shape our propensity for friendship. If you're very interested in this topic, it's discussed extensively in my book, Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. And it's also the case, for reasons I will not go into, that there are deep reasons not only that we have friends, but that we are homophilous, that we prefer the company of people we resemble. And this is a fundamental observation about human beings. It can be a very depressing observation about human beings, but it also can be a very uplifting observation about human beings for a host of complicated reasons that are not directly relevant to the health of the public. Now, if social networks had biological and genetic antecedents and evolutionary significance, it begs the question of how ancient this structure is, or whether we can document such structural features in human populations that live in non-modernized settings. So we wondered, look, if it's the case that there's something genetic and potentially of evolutionary significance to the structure of human social networks, what we would really love to do is to fly back 10,000 years, to the Pleistocene, and map the social networks of people then and see if their networks look the same as ours. And we would theorize that they should be the same if there's something deep and fundamental about human social networks. Now, of course, we couldn't do that. So instead, we decided to map the social networks of an evolutionarily relevant population, specifically the Hadza hunter-gatherers of Tanzania. They're one of the last few remaining populations of hunter-gatherers on the planet. They sleep out under the stars. They have no material possessions to speak of. They hunt and they gather for their food, and they live around Lake Ayasi. And this paper was published, 8 years ago now. And in order to do this, what we did is, very painstakingly, there are only about 1,000 of these people left, we performed a photographic census of all living adult Hadza people. And we printed these onto big posters, like a kind of Hadza Facebook. And we took these into the field. And this is my former postdoc, who's now a professor at UPenn, Corinne Apicella. And Corinne took these posters into the field, and she would just wait near Lake Ayasi, and like a week for like a Hadza person to walk by, because like you couldn't make an appointment to see such a person. You just had to wait till they walked by. And then when she saw them, she would say, "Excuse me, can you tell me who your friends are?" And they would point at the photographs of the people that were their friends. And we asked them who their friends were by using two different techniques. One was what we call the camping network. With whom would you like to live after this camp? So the Hadza form temporary camps of a few people, maybe 30 people, and the camps have no permanent existence. They break up after 6 weeks, and the Hadza relocate somewhere else, and new people fission and fuse into the new camps. We asked these camps, we restricted this to be same-sex networks because we didn't want people to nominate the people they wanted to have sex with on the next camp. So they had to be same-sex in this case, leaving aside the allegedly non-existent prevalence of homosexual behavior in the Hadza people. They could choose people in or out of their current camp, and they could choose up to 10 individuals. We also asked them a gift network, and we said, of all the adults that currently live with you, who would you like to give a gift of honey to? Now, honey is a very valued food among the Hadza. There's a fascinating literature, which I won't go into, one of the very few symbiotic relationships. You know how you guys have read about remoras and sharks, or about that bird that cleans the teeth of crocodiles? Two different species that have a symbiotic relationship. One of the only such relationships documented in humans is between people that live in this part of the world, including the Hadza, and the so-called, I can't remember if it's the honey catcher bird or the honey finder bird, a bird that points the Hadza to where beehives are, and then the Hadza climb the tree to break down the beehives. The Hadza, the humans, get bitten by the bees, but also get honey, and then they leave behind the honeycomb that the birds eat. It's a fascinating example of this very rare behavior seen in other species dyads, and one of the few examples in humans. But it's very painful for the Hadza to get honey. They love it, but they get bitten by bees, okay? So they love honey. And so we decided we would equip them with gifts of honey. Now, of course, we didn't have to do this. We just went to Costco and bought honey sticks. And we bought thousands of honey sticks, and we took them to Tanzania. And we said to our subjects, look, we're going to give you 3 honey sticks. You cannot keep them for yourself. You have to anonymously give them to someone else in your camp as a gift. And this allowed us to discern real social relationships among the Hadza. Everything I told you about in all these methods, we've refined hugely since then. The photographic census method, the gift-giving ascertainment, these are all techniques in the last 10 years that have been advanced by people like Ryan and Margaret and Maggie and other people in the lab. In fact, actually, Maggie has been using a software called Trellis that uses photographic census in Honduras And Ryan is working on a project to actually update our altruistic measurements of altruism in Honduras. And here's what the campmate network looks like among Hadza females. Yes, Ryan, I'm compensating. I just want you to know exactly. No, I see you. So this is the network of the Hadza. Every dot's a person, every line is a relationship. And just visually, if you look at this network, you can see that it looks exactly like the networks that I've been showing you. And the dot size here is proportional to how generous the Hadza are. Bigger dots are more generous people. We also color the dots yellow if they're especially generous. You can see clusters of very kind, cooperative people and of unkind, uncooperative people in the network, which replicates some other findings that we've done in other experiments. But the fundamental point here is this. Despite the fact that, and then if you go on and you throw everything you can, the degree distribution, the existence of homophily, the decay with geographic distance, the further someone is away from you, the less likely you are to think they're your friend. If you measure the transitivity in the Hadza, or something known as the degree assortativity, which is the probability of popular people befriending other popular people, and unpopular people befriending unpopular people, which is something we all remember from high school. The Hadza have that too. Or reciprocity, the tendency that if I say Kitaro is my friend, he will reciprocate the nomination and say I'm his friend. All of these features in the Hadza numerically are about the same as us. And all of these features have functional significance in everything from the evolution of cooperation to the relative ease of the flow of information or of germs in human social networks. And in fact, one of my ways of summarizing these findings is that in a very real way, I think the spread of germs is the price we pay for the spread of information. In other words, we come together to share information with each other. We form networks that are very useful in reinforcing and transmitting valuable information. But in so doing, I expose myself to the risk that you might infect me with a pathogen, and that over time, evolution has balanced these factors, optimizing networks to give us more benefit than cost. So despite the fact that in the last 10,000 years, we've invented agriculture, we've invented cities, we've invented telephony and telecommunications, the structure of human social networks is the same. And this, again, is additional evidence for the deep and fundamental evolutionary significance of human social networks. Let me pause there and see if there are any questions there. Does anyone have any questions? And Maggie can help me. David, you popped up.
A quick question. In terms of the Hadza and donation, and like if they all had to give out 3 sticks, if they all were given 3 sticks and all had to give out, what would make someone more generous if they all were giving the same amount?
Thank you so much. I blew by that deliberately. The donations were just to map the ties. They also played a separate public goods game with honey sticks. So we gave them some honey sticks and we said, you can keep these for yourself, or you could put them in a pot and we will double that pot and then divide it amongst all the members of the camp. And yeah. So we also, it's all in the paper.
Yeah, cool, thank you.
Colin.
Hi, I just was wondering how much of what we've been talking about, like genes and networks, have to do with like the primate study on like dominance expression and sort of standings within social networks. And if that's the case, it then is it necessary to have leaders and followers within our social networks?
There's a fabulous study that's done by a woman called Jessica Flack at the Yerkes Primate Research Center that was also published in Nature. I think I mentioned that study in which what she did is like she did the equivalent in human beings of going to she mapped the network of primates. These are humans, but let's say they were other primates. And she took this person out of the network And then she measured how much violence was there after she did that. They like physically removed that primate from the troop. So this person has high status. They have many connections, let's say. That's a reflection of hierarchy in the grooming relationships, for example. And she found that when she removed that person, the amount of violence between other pairs, like these two people were more, these two primates or humans, the theory is, would be more likely to treat each other violently if you remove this person than if you leave them in. And the idea is there's something about the way networks are organized and the asymmetry in social ties that tamps down on competition between other people. It's actually an argument I go into in Blueprint at length if you're interested in a long and deep answer to your question. Did I partially give you an answer or did I misunderstand your question?
It was a partial answer, yeah.
Yeah, I think I may have misunderstood your question. You're asking what's the relationship between those ideas, between dominance hierarchy and this new kind of network perspective that I'm describing today. Is that your question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, that is discussed in chapter 9, I think, of Blueprint, if you want a longer answer. Next question. Any other questions? Okay. So it turns out we're affected in another way by social networks. We're affected not just by what is flowing through the network, the actual structure of the network also matters. And this is just one example of how network structure might matter in a fashion that's distinct from what's flowing through the network. So now we're interested in not whether germs are spreading or obesity is spreading or voting behavior is spreading. We're interested in the structure of the network. And this is the difference between contagion and connection, okay? So imagine now that so this work was done by one of my favorite social scientists, Brian Utsi. And Brian Utsi grew up in New York. His mother was worked making garments for I think for Broadway shows. And so Brian became very interested in Broadway musicals. And he was interested in the success or failure of Broadway musicals. And he did a very famous piece of work in which he looked at 326 Broadway musical production companies. And he mapped the social networks of the production companies. And he computed something known as the density of network ties, which is very closely related to the transitivity that I introduced to you a few slides ago. So let's imagine there's a Broadway musical production company where there's this person and 5 people to whom that person is connected. There are 5 times 4 divided by 2, 10 possible connections among those people. And here, 0 of those 10 are present, so 0% density. And here, 4 of them are present, 40% density. And here, all of them are present, 100% density. And then what Utsi did is he plotted on the x-axis the density of ties within the Broadway musical production company and the success rate of the Broadway musical based either on the fraction of positive reviews or the amount of money the musical made. And he found that if nobody knew each other from before, the show was a flop. And if everybody knew each other from before, the show was a flop. And that optimal performance was achieved in the middle range of density. And so this is an attribute of the structure of the network. How the network is organized is associated with the ability of that group of people to do something novel, like produce a fantastic show. Probably because you need a mix of people who don't know each other from before, who can bring new ideas to the team, and people who've worked together before, who know how to work together. And you can achieve optimal performance in the middle range. This is similar to the things at the beginning of the last lecture, where I put these hypothetical networks and I said the structure of the network can matter. And this idea is also the same idea in the Behrman study that is in your readings about suicidal ideation among teenage girls. Now, in the Behrman study, the functional form is not the same. That's not the point. I am not saying that anything you map on the y-axis will have the same shape when you map the density on the x-axis. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that the density may relate to some outcome. So in the Behrman study, what he found is that the less likely girls' friends were to be friends with each other, the more likely they were to think of killing themselves. So there was a declining line. So low density, like if you two can't get along, I'm going to kill myself. Whereas if you're surrounded by friends who are friends with each other, you are less likely to think about killing yourself. That's the finding, the key finding in the Behrman study. Now, we also eventually began to study networks of doctors. And to do this, to discern networks of doctors, we began to use the metric of shared patients. Technically in the field, this is known as bipartite networks, B-I-P-A-R-T-I-T-E. Bipartite networks, that means there are two parts, two different kinds of nodes. So imagine that you have doctors, 1, 2, 3, and 4 in purple, and patients indexed by letters in yellow. So doctor number 1 sees patients A, B, C, D, and E, and doctor number 2 sees patients B, D, F, and G, and so on. And so what this means is that you can use insurance claims. So every time a doctor sees a patient, they say, I saw Mr. Jones on this date for this diagnosis. Those claims are filed. It meant that we could take those millions of claims and process them and discern networks of doctors based on patients they shared in common. So doctors 1 and 2 share 2 patients in common, 2, 3, and 4 each share 1 patient in common and form a little transitively closed triad over here. And so this means we could map the networks of doctors in the whole United States using insurance claims. And that therefore we could begin to study, for example, the diffusion of innovation or of healthcare properties and practices within social networks of doctors. So this shows some work that we did a while ago. Every dot is a doctor, and every line between them is whether or not they have a relationship because they share patients. Let's say more than 10 patients in the last year. We color the dots according to the specialty of the doctor. So the red dots are primary care physicians, and the other dots are specialists. And this is one hospital in New York State that had 300,000 patient days and had about 1,000 or 850 doctors. And in this hospital, where the specialists are in the middle of the network and have high centrality, we found that it cost on average $104,000 to take care of patients in the last 2 years of life. And that patients spent 48 days in the hospital in the last 2 years of life. And then we could contrast this to another similar hospital in New York with a similar number of patient days and a similar number of doctors. But here in this hospital, the primary care physicians in red occupy the more central position. And in this hospital, the costs were less than half, $46,000 spent in the last 2 years of life and 25 days in the hospital spent in the last 2 years of life. So the structural organization of the network of doctors in a hospital can give rise to the nature of care delivered by that hospital to patients. The kind of end-of-life care given to patients is an emergent property of the network structure of the doctors in the hospital. That's an effect of connection. You can use the same kinds of networks to study an effect of contagion. This is a network of 610 physicians in Raleigh-Durham, and whether or not they prescribe Januvia, a prescription medication for diabetes. Same kind of principles as before. Every dot is a doctor. We map the networks according to how many patients they share in common. The orange dots have prescribed Januvia, and the dot size is proportional to how much Januvia they prescribed. The yellow dots have not prescribed Januvia. Once again, we see clusters of Januvia prescribers and non-prescribers here and here, for instance, that spread out to 3 degrees of separation. And we begin to gain new insights into the diffusion of innovation. For example, look at this doctor here. He or she is surrounded by heavy Januvia prescribers, but resolutely resists prescribing Januvia, perhaps closing off the flow of information about Januvia prescribing down this peninsula of doctors in the network down and to the left. So all the kinds of tools that we've been describing and learning about in the last 2 lectures could be deployed in this way as well. Well, let me sum up with 2 or 3 slides that communicate a kind of big idea that's very important about the social sciences related to what we've been discussing in networks. Because social networks offer a new way to understand human behaviors and human society. One classic way of understanding collective human behavior is to examine the choices of and actions of individuals. For example, we can see markets and elections and riots as the mere byproducts of individual decisions to buy and sell goods, cast a ballot, or express anger. And the classic example of this approach, which is an 18th century approach, and which is known as methodological individualism, is provided by Adam Smith's conception of markets as a simple sum of individuals' willingness to supply or demand a good. So Adam Smith says, if you want to understand this collective thing known as markets or riots or elections, you just need to study individuals. And each individual is acting in the furtherance of their own rational interest and gives rise to this collective expression that like riots or markets or elections, for example. Another classic way of understanding collective human behavior dispenses with individuals and focuses exclusively on groups delineated, say, by class or race, each of which is claimed to have or has collective identities that might cause people in these groups to act in concert. Some scholars in this tradition, such as Karl Marx, believe that these groups can have their own consciousness, imbuing them with an indivisible personality that cannot be deduced or understood merely from studying the actions of its members. And other scientists have also focused on the primacy of group culture. For example, the very first lecture of the class, I introduced you to the ideas advanced by sociologist Emil Durkheim, who argued that the relatively constant rates of suicide in different religious groups across time could not be explained by the actions of any individuals, since the groups had an enduring reality that long outlasted the lives of their members. How was it, he wondered, that people came and went, the individuals came and went, but the suicide rate in French Protestants stayed the same? This approach, this conceptualization, is known as methodological holism. And this approach sees social phenomena as having a totality that is distinct from individuals and that cannot be understood by merely studying individuals. This is a kind of 19th century social scientific posture with respect to how to understand collective properties. Now, 20th century social scientists often focused on how membership of individuals in groups via the sharing of particular traits or attributes could help explain their behavior and collective phenomena. So in the 20th century, we saw the kind of rapid rise in regression-based modeling to understand human behavior. So what we said is, I'm going to tally for each of you, how rich or poor are you? What race or ethnicity do you have? What gender do you have? You know, what major do you have? What zip code do you live in? And I'm going to tally all these up, and each of those represents membership in a group of an individual, and sum those up using some kind of linear model, and then predict the emergence, let's say, of different kinds of fashions or trends. You know, who likes, you know, Pokemon? Young, you know, boys like Pokemon. That's how I explain the emergence of Pokemon, for example. It's not like a Marxian bourgeoisie like Pokemon. It's not like Adam Smith say, oh no, there's nothing about Pokemon fans. It's just individual people. So there's a kind of regression-based framework for predicting this. These two traditions, methodological individualism and methodological holism, shed light on the human condition, but they miss something essential. In contrast to both individualism and holism, the science of social networks offers an alternative way of understanding human society, because it is about both individuals and groups. And indeed, it's about how the former become the latter. Interconnections between people give rise to phenomena that are not present within individuals and that are not reducible to their solitary desires and actions. And you've seen many examples of that, both with respect to connection and contagion in the last 2 lectures. Hence, methodological individualism seeks explanations for social phenomena, or says that explanations for social phenomena like social class or markets or power or institutions must be formulated as or are reducible to the characteristics or actions of individuals. Methodological holism, on the other hand, says that each social entity, group, institution, network, and so on, has a totality that is distinct from and cannot be understood by merely studying its individual component elements. Of course, you can imagine I'm very much in the latter camp, but I am not saying that the former camp is not hugely valuable. And finally, in another meta point that I think is important for you to understand in order to be educated people, is that the study of social networks is in fact part of a much broader, what I have called, assembly project in modern science. For the last 400 years, swept by a reductionistic fervor and by considerable success, scientists have been purposefully examining ever smaller bits of nature in order to understand the whole. We've disassembled life into organs, then cells, then molecules, then genes. We've disassembled matter into atoms, then nuclei, then subatomic particles. We've invented everything from microscopes to supercolliders to help us advance this, reductionistic project. But across many disciplines, scientists are now trying to put the parts back together, whether macromolecules into cells, neurons into brains, species into ecosystems, nutrients into foods, or people into networks. Scientists are turning their attention to how and why the parts fit together and to the rules that govern interconnection and coherence. And understanding the structure and function of social networks and the phenomenon of emergence in social networks is part of this awesome scientific movement in my regard. Okay, any questions before I let you go? I'm going to ask you myself, are you learning? You learning something? You're learning. Good. Good. All right. Thank you, guys. I'll see you next week.
Thank you.